There it is.
Right, okay.
But I would probably turn it back on.
Good evening. I'm Klaus Rinn, the director of the Center for the Study of Statesmanship. And if you do not know what CSS is about, let me just tell you very briefly. We explore the sources of respectful relations among groups, countries, and civilizations. What kind of leadership can put a check on belligerence and diffuse conflict? CSS, I think it might be said, is in effect trying to develop a new realism, a new grand strategy for the present age. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion of what international relations might look like in a world which President Trump has introduced a great deal of uncertainty. The role that America ought to play in the world has divided opinion for decades. After the implosion of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, some argued that now an emergency was over and America should reassess its involvement and redirect its resources. But another, much more powerful, more influential group asserted that no, history had handed the now only superpower an opportunity to create a better world. The Cold War alliance between Republicans and Democrats, hawkish people in both camps, should now turn its attention to spreading freedom and democracy. In the wake of 9/11, two leading neoconservatives went so far as to define the goal of U.S. foreign policy as an end to evil, the title of their co-authored book. But especially after foreign policy blunders in the Middle East, opposition to American interventionism has intensified. Views deeply ingrained in America's foreign policy establishment are being challenged. President Trump seems, at least on some days, to want to change America's basic course, even as some of his foreign policy advisors are pushing in a completely different direction. Tonight's discussion will help us understand the basic issues of this controversy. The debate will feature prominent representatives of contrasting points of view. And I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator, Kathy Gilsenan, who writes for The Atlantic. She's an expert on national security and international security issues. She has degrees from Columbia University and Stanford, and Kathy will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you are already mic'd up.
I think I'm already
right?
mic'd up, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, that was wonderful. I believe the title of this panel is called Welcome to the Jungle, so we'll have to do a musical number at some point, maybe. Just kidding. It's my pleasure now to introduce the panelists. Robert Kagan is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings and a monthly columnist at the Washington Post. His most recent book, The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World, discusses many of the very issues that we're going to be discussing tonight. Politico magazine named him one of the Politico 50, a group of top, quote, thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. He served in the State Department from 1984 to 1988 as part of the policy planning staff and as principal speechwriter for Secretary George P. Shultz. He's a graduate of Yale and Harvard's Kennedy School and holds a PhD in history from AU. Patrick Porter is a professor of international security and strategy at the University of Birmingham. He's also a fellow at the Quincy Institute and a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, London. His forthcoming book is The False Promise of the Liberal Order, Nostalgia, Delusion, and the Rise of Trump. So you can see we're getting to some conflict here. 20% off flyers at the registration desk. He's also written articles in International Security, the Journal of Strategic Studies, International Affairs, and other scholarly journals. His doctorate is from the University of Oxford. So what I'd like to do now is allow each of these folks to lay out in about 10 minutes or so their opening salvos, and then we'll just have a conversation for a while, and eventually we'll open it up to questions from you all. So Robert, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it, and thanks to Catholic University for sponsoring this, and thank you all for coming out. It's foreign policy is not at the top of the American public agenda, so every time people come out to listen, talk about foreign policy, I think it's a good thing. Let me also just take a few of my precious moments to congratulate Patrick on his new book, which I have read and commend to all of you. And unfortunately, I think you have to wait till April before it comes out, but I would run out and get it. It's a very thoughtful statement of a certain kind of view of what American foreign policy should be, and I really think you'll all enjoy it. So, and it's a pleasure to be having this discussion with Patrick. You know, to me, so much of this, of trying to decide what American foreign policy should be, or for that matter, any country's foreign policy should be, depends on what you think about how the world works. You know, if you have a fairly benign view, as we often have, there was a time, I think, right after the Cold War when people sort of thought, well, everything's heading in the right direction. It was the end of history, so-called. Geopolitical competition was ending, etc. And that might lead to a certain view of what was necessary or not necessary for the United States and other nations to do. So if you think things are generally fine, you might say, well, if things are fine, why are you mucking around and making things worse, which I think is a view that some people hold. If you think the natural state of things is, Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short, that nations naturally move, that conflict and chaos are sort of the natural qualities of the international system, or even that human nature is not only desirous of freedom, but also desirous of tyranny at times, and human nature can be very nasty as well. Well, that might lead you into a different direction. And so I don't think Patrick necessarily uses the word restraint, but restraint is very much at the heart of what many people are calling for, and restraint can be a good thing, depending on circumstances. There are also times when restraint is probably the wrong thing. You know, if your neighbor's kitchen is on fire and you have a fire extinguisher to put it out, restraint may not be the right answer. But if the fire is beyond your capacity to deal with, then you probably have another answer. So all these conditions are what should be guiding us in our determination of what foreign policy should be. So to my mind, the way I look at the world is I do take a somewhat darker and more pessimistic view of what things head toward naturally. I think we've been living in a pretty unusually benevolent period in human history, and I say that fully conscious of all the disasters that have occurred. And I think it's absurd to say that this system that's existed roughly since 1945 hasn't not only had its share of disasters and horrors, but has also in some cases been the cause of those disasters and horrors. The question is, in my mind, and I think it always needs to be in the forefront of our minds, is compared to what? And I think when I think about this last period, which has all the difficulties it's had, I still think it is preferable, for instance, to the period of history that preceded this era. And not really just that. I mean, if you go back and you look at the whole course of human history, you will find that whether they're city-states or empires or nations, they are, the leading of all those types are almost constantly at war with one another. There's very few moments in history when the leading powers in one form or another are not at war. So if that's the norm, then we've lived through quite a remarkable period in which great power conflict has not been one of the features of the international system, although conflicts in general certainly have been. It has also been a particularly democratic period in history compared to the rest of human history. Democracy was the rarest form of government until really the last 70 years, and now it's a very common form of government. Again, and by the way, we can have a long discussion about the failings of democracy, but it depends on what you think the better alternative is. So that's been remarkable, and then finally, it's been a period of unprecedented economic prosperity. Really, throughout most of human history, almost literally everybody was living in abject poverty. And in this period, we've seen sort of rather extraordinary global growth, which has spread to all the world. That's why you see China and India and other countries have really made remarkable strides economically. So, again, you can think that all of this is simply the natural evolution of the species. I don't. I think it is the product of a certain structure of power in the international system which has favored the leading power in that system, which happens to be a democratic capitalist country. And that, should we move away from this basic structure of international relations, and I'm very reluctant to talk about a liberal world order because that comes with all kinds of other implications, but the sort of basic power structure of the system has favored these attributes of the international system, and insofar as this order changes, you'll have different attributes that are favored, and maybe you'll have chaos, the normal chaos and conflict of the international system. And I think that's what's at stake. Now, we can have a perfectly reasonable discussion about how to preserve that, and in some respects, that is the discussion that Patrick and I are having. Even though Patrick talks about the false promise of liberal world order, I must say when I read his book, I don't think he's throwing it all out. I think he's looking for a better way to sort of sustain what we've had. There are those who would say, let's just throw it all out. It's a disaster. America should just come home and that's the it. I'll let Patrick speak for himself, obviously, but I don't think that's his argument. So there are ways of thinking about it. But the fundamental structure, and I'll end by saying this, what is unique about this system has been the fact that Europe, which was for centuries, going back to time immemorial, a cockpit of great power conflict, has not been a scene of great power conflict since 1945. And Asia, which ever since the rise of Japan after the Meiji Restoration became a cockpit of conflict, mostly between Japan and China and mostly at China's expense, Asia is now also a relatively peaceful, if not imperiled, part of the world. And both of these are due to the presence of the United States as a major player within each of those regions. And that structure, I believe, is what has undergirded this peace, and in many ways that I can get into, also undergirded the prosperity and undergirded the spread of democracy, that all of it can be traced back to the extension of American influence into these two regions to sort of put a cork in their history of conflict. And I would be very wary of removing that cork because I do fear that it would lead to a return to normal. And normal looks a lot more like the first half of the 20th century than like the last 75 years.
Patrick, what do you say?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Bob, very much for the commendation on the book. I owe you a slice of the royalties.
I won't spend it all in one place, but don't worry.
Thank you very much for making this possible to Catholic University. Thank you to our wonderful moderator. And I'm especially grateful to be able to talk about this. And there's a number of things, Bob and I have some disagreements, but there's a number of things I really like about Bob's work. He doesn't traffic in euphemisms. He just speaks very directly in a way about fundamental questions of order and security and power. And there is a very grounded pessimism, and both of us actually begin from a rather dark pessimistic worldview, that we don't think there is a moral arc of the universe, that history is directional, that what we actually have is very contingent and could have been very different, and it could all go horribly wrong. And we're also from the starting point that things now are bad. It's in a way quite distressing to be in the United States to watch a republic what looks like destroying itself, and I don't think that's too melodramatic to say so. I'm reminded a bit of what Abraham Lincoln said in his first speech at the Lyceum in 1838, that should America fall, should it fail, it won't be at the hands of some transatlantic military giant that comes over to conquer us. It will be by our own hand. That there is something potentially self-destructive and fragile about this republic. And what I try and argue is that Donald Trump is both symptom and catalyst of that breakdown, that a coming together of a number of forces of oligarchy, of militarism, of corruption. And the worry I really have is quite an old one, which is that what we're seeing is this interaction of disarray and disaster abroad and strife at home. These things feeding off each other and producing Trump and Trumpism and all it could lead to. And we've all recently actually come very close to a war in the Gulf again. In January, discovering just how close the Iranian retaliations came to, for example, killing US service personnel, and how that would have created pressure to escalate further, etc. So it could be even worse. In response to what's going on, I think there is something going on in politics in the West generally, which is what we might call restoration politics. That is, people are promising to bring things back, right? Make America great again, take back control, etc. And I think there is also a sense of restoration politics around some of the what I call liberal orthodox view that there is something that we can return to. Joe Biden himself said quite recently, America is coming back, true to our alliances, faithful, telling the truth, etc. I think it's very hard for this country to debate foreign policy in a sense because it had so much both luck and skill. It rose in a way that was relatively cheap, coming through the 20th century, through the war in which its rivals destroyed each other. The costs it bore were much lower than other countries. And people tend to compare the foreign policy now to the possibilities of a very non-typical time, the 1940s particularly, when America was at its apex. Vast relative power, atomic monopoly, 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, the world crying out for its patronage and its loans and its weapons. Very confident country, and one in which it could say in NSC 68 that the absence of order cannot be tolerated, that there was this sense of power and ambition to stamp out disorder that it couldn't tolerate. And I think that expectation is of a world that has gone. Whatever comes next, that level of almost artificial lopsidedness in power is gone. That whatever else has happened, there has been a relative shift of power and wealth. And what I try and argue in the book is that if we actually go back and read that world that America made, to use Bob's term, if we look under the bonnet, we see something more fraught going on than what you might call liberal order. It wasn't always liberal means for liberal ends, as it were, which is the essence of the thesis. And I try and argue that actually the whole proposition of liberal order is impossible, that ordering is rough work, even for the gentlest hegemon we've ever had, even for the most enlightened, better than anything else we've had before. That this is a world of resistance. I think one of the reasons the world in fact has avoided major war is due to nuclear proliferation, some of which happened against America's wishes, right? So one of the ironies is actually that resistance also shaped this world and made major war less likely. I think it's also misleading because the way in which the United States ordered this world was not one that subordinated itself to rules and institutions. It exercised the privileges of a superpower, of a hegemon, that wanted rules and institutions for others to follow, and it would exempt itself at a number of times in order to retain its ascendancy, retain its advantage. And I think even if there were a superpower that wanted to create a benign, liberal, rules-based order, it looks too much to rivals like the dangerous accumulation of power, right? Even if one's intentions were perfectly benign, there is a security dilemma problem here. In a world that is conflicted, that is dangerous, where things are very uncertain, and we call it this jungle, it's very hard to see clearly that if someone is accumulating what looks like overwhelming power that could be turned against you, it's very hard to take that on trust, it's very hard to believe the good intentions, and no responsible statesman or stateswoman in Iran, in China, in Russia, in North Korea could afford to accept that, or even that you might not change your intentions tomorrow or 10 years down the line. So let's talk a bit about how America made this world, because I think by getting into the history, we can get a clearer sense of what the choices are now. So think about America's greatest achievements, to follow on what Bob was saying. Defeating fascist powers and turning them into proud social democracies. Containing the Soviet Union without a major war. The opening to China in 1972. The prosperity of the Pacific Rim countries. The termination of the Balkan Wars with the Dayton Accords, etc. With each of these achievements, there was what I call a bargain with illiberal forces. There was a darkness in that, right? So look at how America helped transform Japan. It helped Emperor Hirohito clean up his reputation, avoid accountability, be repackaged as a kind of ceremonial, innocent emperor who was not guilty of any of the atrocities of wartime Japan. Former Nazi officers, etc., brought in to America's nuclear and scientific programs, even ones who were guilty of committing experiments in camps, right? And even some of them being involved in America's intelligence efforts in Europe. The opening to China in 1972, right, often heralded as this great geopolitical achievement, and I think it was, but it came at a real price, and there was real betrayal in that, right? Betrayal of the Tibetans, betrayal of the Taiwanese, the betrayal of the victims of the Bangladesh massacre, because America achieved talks through Pakistan as intermediary by being strictly silent about the genocide that was going on, and it produced the blood telegram. And the Dayton Accords, which of course locks in tribalism and locks out a lot of ethnic groups. Each of these achievements can be defended or attacked, and I would defend them, but in order to do them, they had to do something that was quite illiberal, which was strike these very unattractive, very uncomfortable bargains. And I think if there's one continuity in history, it's that there's no free lunches, and there are similar choices the US faces today about navigating ahead so that it can do what its American foreign policy is supposed to do, which is to preserve its republican institutions in an increasingly multipolar, insecure world. And paradoxically, when America has actually been much more doctrinaire, when it's been much more zealous with its liberalism, that's when things seem to have gone much more wrong, right? The disappointing wars, but also something that's often not talked about, the shock therapy program, the great experiment in Russia at the end of the Cold War, right? The kind of crash introduction to overnight capitalism, etc., with lots of Harvard wonks and lots of Russian collaborators as well, or cooperators as well in doing that, and helped to create this kind of oligarchy that we're so worried about now. So what does this tell us about the choices we have, the United States has, and its allies? I think there's a number of things that the US needs to do, and in a sense, my response to what the US should do is much less heroic, much less sort of bold than Bob's. And generally speaking, there is an argument whereby authoritarianism is the great enemy, and the response to that is a kind of call to arms of the democracies of the world to stand up to that authoritarianism. I think it would be better to disaggregate rather than aggregate enemies, and to encourage, where you can, divisions and distinctions amongst them. And I think one of the most important areas of the policy space at the moment is the triangular relationship between Russia, China, and the United States. And there is a problem, I think, that inadvertently, accidentally, the US has encouraged both to recognize a common enemy and to start increasingly collaborating, where an axis actually could form. And one of the central purposes of American foreign policy is precisely to prevent the formation of a Eurasian super threat. I don't mean to say that the US can go in and manipulate them into kind of becoming a hammer against one another, but to put it very bluntly, I would encourage an entente with Russia in order to encourage the Russia and China to develop a natural friction as neighbours again, who share a common space. That would involve some betrayal. I think a pledge for no further expansion, especially the Caucasus, especially Ukraine and Georgia, in return for a pledge for no further interference, and a number of other things that could go on with that. For example, signing the New START Treaty, which is a doable thing, but agreements about arms control, about cyber control, etc. Russia has a choice in this, right? This is not just made by the United States. Russia and China get to choose the world order we're in as well. But to do that, not because I'm not trying to appeal to your hearts, I'm trying to appeal to your heads, so that the US can better balance and contain a rising China, which I think does actually threaten the liberties that it cares about in a number of ways. I think an end to regime change as a default setting for quite a lot of foreign policy choices. I think cutting ties with some of the most unreliable Saudi Gulf partners, not because we are offended by the way they run their societies, but because they promiscuously violate American interests against America's requests. And either America hasn't got enough influence in the Gulf or it's very reluctant to use it. But there is, if we're going to say this phrase, ending endless war, and I think we should, it has to mean something, and it has to mean a change in behaviour and a change in ideas, not just as a kind of soundbite. And the greater Middle East seems to be the place which generates a lot of these futile wars that have actually produced the nightmare of Trumpism, the kind of coarsening of politics, the racism, the deference of Congress to an imperial presidency, the ever-mounting deficits, etc. So what are some of the core differences on this point between what Bob has written and what I've written? Because I think there are some number of departures about how we handle this jungle that's sort of growing back. Because I think both of our arguments have recognisable roots in the 19th century and 18th century American tradition. I think there is a danger of people getting into what I call founding fatherism, where you try and enlist sort of founding fathers onto your side of the argument. I think there are strands of both of our arguments in the likes of John Quincy, George Washington, John Adams, etc. But I think the US can probably tolerate more disorder in some places than Bob can. I think I'm probably more optimistic on that point, that there will be more violent disorder in the coming world, and that includes in some of the vacuums the US might leave open. I think there is an important distinction to be drawn between making a world safe for democracy and making the world democratic. That over-striving to spread democracy abroad will not successfully do that, but it may well destroy it at home, is destroying it at home. And the analogy of the jungle is going to come up. And my fear is that by wading deep into the jungle, it won't clear it, but we might all get lost in it. So it's on that rather sunny, optimistic note that I'll stop.
I do want to stay on the pessimism here for a while, because that does seem to be the common point of departure for you both, even if you diagnose the potential solutions, if there are solutions to be had, a bit differently. And I want to drill down a little bit in, I believe what you just said was things are bad right now, and there's no fundamental argument here on whether there is a jungle and whether it is encroaching back. The answer for both of you, it would seem to be, is yes. Where do you locate the beginning of this? Because it certainly seems to predate Trump, right? You were writing as far back as 2014 that superpowers don't get to retire. When did this badness start in your mind, and how does it compare to previous eras of badness? For instance, in the 60s when you had de Gaulle withdrawing from NATO and Willy Brandt pursuing Ostpolitik. How bad is it really?
Well, I don't think that it's, compared to historical, various pasts, it's not so bad. I mean, things right now are not in terrible shape. The difficulty is in answering the question, how close is it to being in terrible shape? And I always like to, sort of, if we were here in 1928, Germany was a democracy. The Nazis had just done as badly as they'd ever done. They got 2% of the vote in 1928. Japan was a democracy. We had the Kellogg-Briand Pact. We had the Spirit of Locarno, etc. It was possible. There's a historian named Adam Tooze who begins his book by quoting Winston Churchill saying, "The world is in fabulous shape. We've never known it." So, and then 5 years later, it was all gone. And I think it might have been possible to know. It should have been possible to know, and some people did know that 1928 things weren't that great. But it was also very easy to believe that they were. So, is this 1928 or is it 1970, where things all, in the early 70s, things were also looked terrible, worse than they do now, by the way. Including, by the way, in a certain sense, American domestic politics was arguably worse than it is now. I hate to say that to some people, that may seem like apostasy, but I think, and yet things got better. So it's a little bit hard to know exactly. And I think one place where I actually think Patrick is more pessimistic about the sustainability of the present international system than I am. I actually think it is relatively sustainable. I actually don't think America no longer has the capacity to sustain it. These are things we can argue about. Now, on the other hand, when you first began that question, you said, when did the badness start? And well, the badness started like with the origins of the human race. And when a lot of what we see around the world today is just humans being human, that we are seeing a rebellion against liberalism, and we are seeing that both here and definitely in Europe and elsewhere. We're shocked by that because we're all Fukuyamaists and we thought that argument was over. But that argument is never over. And the truth is, liberalism, in many respects, it may be a natural outgrowth of human nature, but in many respects it's antithetical to human nature. Because liberalism, and by liberalism I mean elevating the rights of the individual over the government, over the state, and over the community, which is what we do in the United States and some other countries do as well. That's not a natural human instinct. The natural human instinct is, I want to have my rights taken care of. I'm not so sure I care about their rights. And so to have this system is quite unusual, and it cuts against all kinds of things that people care about. Religious belief, which liberalism has a tendency to sort of undercut. All kinds of hierarchies, race, tribe, ethnicity, all these things that bind people together are undercut by liberalism. So there is a natural rebellion against it at all times. And that's what I mean by the jungle. The jungle, I'm going to stop talking in 1 second, but the jungle is about natural force. The jungle is a natural force. It's not an evil force. It just is. And I think we just have to understand that these forces are always going to be out there.
I think much of the trouble began when America won. For America, for its own capacity to act prudently, there's something very dangerous and intoxicating about success. In the international system of anarchy, which we talk about, or the jungle, it's a dangerous place not just because it's inherently insecure, it's a dangerous place because it's very easy to fall prey to hubris, to start to believe that your success is a sign of inherent wisdom and clairvoyance. I mean, Madeleine Albright's line about we see further because we are the United States, that we have this capacity for long-range vision and insight. It's when you start telling yourself those things that error can flow. And when liberalism stops being a thing that is negotiated along with a lot of other human fundamentals like community, like the need for a balance between the state and the market and civil society, like when we start to worship markets, or when we start to have over-ambitious ideas of what military power is for, that's when it starts to become self-defeating. I read this very disturbing statistic this morning that 11.5% or something of GDP is untaxed offshore wealth. This is one of the things that it leads to. There is this kind of hoarding and misallocation of resources that desperately need to be spent in other things. And what's distressing is how quickly this happened. It was only not that long ago, I think, that President Bill Clinton spoke at Georgetown saying that it's never been this good in terms of America's relative position, in terms of budget surpluses, in terms of the power and the knowledge at its command, how quickly that can slip out of control. So I agree with Bob that things have been indeed worse at other times, but I'm distressed at how the speed with which we have hurtled into this position now. And I think there is a danger of something significantly bad happening, another global financial crisis, even a major war. So,
Can I just follow up
Yeah,
on that?
yeah.
I mean, because I mean, sometimes I feel like we're blaming liberalism for things that are not necessarily liberalism's fault. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
human greed is not the invention of liberalism, and liberalism also didn't end it, but it certainly is not caused by it. But I think in a more fundamental question I have, Patrick, is let's assume that people behaved arrogantly, etc. You wouldn't say, I don't think, that is why we are in a geopolitical competition with China. You're not suggesting that had the United States behaved in a smarter fashion or a better fashion or a less arrogant fashion that we would not be in a geopolitical competition, I assume, or Russia as well.
yes, I think there's likely there would have been a resumption of multipolar competition of some kind. I think the shared fear of America, some of America's voluntary behaviour has helped to encourage them to start getting together, though. That competition we're talking about is worse than it might otherwise have been, and part of the task of the statecraft is to make it more manageable, to have competition that we can live with, rather than something that is out of control. For instance, I mean, Putin and Xi Jinping have agency. Not everything Russia and China does is reactive to what others do, right? But there is a sense in which in Russia they see themselves as defending themselves from a kind of oncoming force of sort of revolutionary upheaval, of colour revolutions, of regime change, of competition for nuclear supremacy, etc. Yes, you're absolutely right. That at some point there would have been some resumption. I think it's graver than it needs to have been, and earlier. And the US is in a position where it's much more depleted than it ought to have been.
I mean, there's a very interesting question. By the way, I don't mean to be jumping on over your. Okay.
You're doing
I mean, this does get to the level of sort of strategy and tactics rather than grand worldview. I mean, if I question the depth of, you know, Russian-Chinese cooperation, how far it could go, and how much influence we actually have over it. I mean, it seems to me that, and we can get into what it means, and I would like to get into what it means to try to accommodate Russia in a way that brings them over to our side. I think there are all kinds of elements of what Russian identity is that gives it a certain view of its place in Europe that in a way is hard for us to satisfy, and I could get into that. But I actually am fairly dubious that, as I say, that there is real, you know, Russian-Chinese cooperation. At the end of the day, I believe that even though Russians spend all their time, especially under Putin, talking about the threat from the West, it's the threat from the East that frightens them the most. They're the ones who live next to an over billion population with an empty Siberia that they're absolutely convinced and are probably right to believe will ultimately be settled by Chinese. They have a long history of going to war with each other, whereas ironically the United States and Russia have no history of going to war with each other. And so I just wonder whether there really is that much room there to play around. But again, to me, the larger point is, I think that this geopolitical competition was unavoidable. And I'm not sure whether we made it worse or we didn't make it worse. But even going forward, I'm not sure how we're supposed to necessarily make it better.
So let's dwell on that for a second, because to revisit your earlier question about that phrase that we didn't want to dwell on, which is liberal international order, and the question of compared to what, right? What if we assume? Well, let's talk through what you think is the future of that potential order, whether it's liberal international or otherwise. You seem to suggest that it's pretty sustainable. Maybe are there any tweaks you would suggest, or different areas of priority? Pivot to Asia, for example.
I mean, again, it always gets down to what does one mean by the order? And so what I mean by the order is it's very much a security order that is the basic pillars of which are a peaceful Europe with an American role that is maintaining the peace of Europe. And we should get into a discussion about whether the European peace that we've grown accustomed to is just something that's now eternal, or whether it is something that is, as you said in your opening comments, contingent on the fact that the United States in a way solved the European equation after World War II. And that's its greatest contribution. I mean, the defeat of Germany is also important, but it was the resolution of the European problem, it seems to me, that the United States has played such a big role in. And that exists, and then, as I was saying, also that's the security structure in Asia, which, by the way, has been the best thing that ever happened to China. Because China, before this security order was established, was just a victim for 70 plus years of various, well, more than 70 plus years. First, it was the victim of European empires, and then it was the victim of Japan. And basically, the post-war order put an end to that and allowed China to become the China that it is today. And so that's what I mean as the order. And now, what was your question? Whether it's sustained, whether it...
Well, what is you're more optimistic about the sustainability of the order.
And the reason is that I think that, first of all, my view is that as long as those basic security structures are in place, the U.S.-Japan relationship on one side and the U.S.-European relationship on the other, I think that Russia and China are both heavily constrained in what they can do. Russia in particular. I mean, Dean Acheson, you wanted a Dean Acheson joke. So Dean Acheson, referred to the Soviet Union as Upper Volta with rockets. And for those of you who remember what Upper Volta is, what is it now? Burkina Faso? What is Upper Volta now? I can't remember. Anyway, and there is a certain truth to that. A Russia that is behind the Urals is not, in a certain sense, a great power. They have a lot of nuclear weapons, but they are fundamentally weak. Russia's strength, historically, comes only when the West, you'll pardon me for using that term, is in conflict with itself. Russia was the great beneficiary of European conflicts, whether it was whether it was the war against Napoleon, which allowed the Russians to enter Paris one day, or whether it was World War II, which left Russia with this incredible expanse of control in Europe. When Europe is coherent and in some ordered shape, Russia's an afterthought. It's back off to the side. So I don't really think that Russia has a lot of room to maneuver. We could talk about whether they would have more room to maneuver if we followed Patrick's policy, and we can have that discussion. China obviously is a bigger problem, but the strategic obstacles to China's becoming even the regional hegemon, which is its reasonable and its predictable aspiration, the obstacles are enormous. It is feared by every power in its periphery, and some of those powers are very substantial. Japan has probably the third or fourth largest military in the world, very quietly. We don't think about it, but it's true. And they could go nuclear and have 100 nuclear weapons in 2 weeks if they wanted to. Korea is a very substantial power. Vietnam is a second-level power, but still the Chinese had a little bit of difficulty defeating them, and we have Australia, et cetera. And behind all of them is this sort of immune, untouchable superpower. And that is my basic feeling for why maybe Patrick and I disagree about the sustainability of this. It is still the case that the United States, not through intelligence, believe me, I'm a historian of American foreign policy, intelligence is not a big part of it. Geographical circumstances are the biggest source of America's role in the world today, and it's relative, the distance, even in a modern era, the distance and relative immunity that it has from attack, while being able to project its force and support allies around China's periphery. I think that's a very tough nut for the Chinese to crack.
It's interesting to reflect, though, that some of the order that we're talking about actually helped facilitate China's rise and therefore the geopolitical competition that we're also nervous about today, right?
Yeah.
This is fascinating. I mean, just a couple of points. I mean, I'm actually thrilled that I've been accused by Robert Kagan of threat inflation.
Hey, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah. So, in terms of talking about No, as in, it's impressive of me to have got to that point. But in terms of what order is, I mean, there's this real question here.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems in talking about it, we tend to talk about it in a frozen way, sort of security orders and hierarchies, and those are true. But war, after World War II, war in Asia was a huge part of shaping this world. I mean, and really intense, really consuming war. The bloodlands across that whole sort of region of the Cold War, the Vietnam, Korea, and the kind of the great purges. I mean, Indonesia, with some support from the CIA, kind of massive purge of communists. That, in other words, when we think about the post-war order, quite often in the kind of snapshot summaries, we think about prosperity, free trade, and peace. And that may be where it has sort of got to, but the birth pangs of that, it was quite horrific when you read some of this. I mean, quite a lot of the countries that are now sort of celebrated for being part of a globally integrated free trade system evolved after 1945 as protectionist states and under martial law. And the reason I say that is that it's all too easy to, by kind of looking away from that unintentionally, to think about ordering now as a similarly peaceful thing, rather than something that always teeters on the edge of something much more coercive and violent, and not always in a wise way. And this comes to another point, speaking of Asia and speaking of Europe. This is also a really important debate for America's allies to have, and they're not having it enough. I think there is a myopia in the country of my birth, Australia, and the country of my dual citizenship in Britain, where there is an even stronger desire to romanticise the relationship with the United States. So if you go past the US Embassy in Washington, it says it has this rather, well, I think bilious-inducing statement, 100 years of mateship, right? So it's friendship and cultural kinship, with the kind of implicit idea that actually Australia can kind of muddle through by trading with China, having America as its main security provider, and not really having to make a choice, and not really having to rearm as much as it could, on the assumption that it has this English-speaking great and powerful friend that will ride to its rescue. And I don't think a country can proceed on that assumption responsibly, given the increasingly dangerous neighbourhood Australia is in. But by telling these stories about the past, by romanticising that link, that it makes it hard to confront the choices of today. Britain, if you look at some of the way in which some people are talking about the Brexit future, they're remembering a 19th century in which Britain was a buccaneering free trade, sort of daring-do power, forgetting and not mentioning empire, and not mentioning actually vast amounts of British protectionism, even in the golden age of free trade. And therefore, walking into this very tragic situation where it's thinking it can have what it wants from continental Europe and the EU, it can have Huawei and bandwagoning with China, and it can help America contain China in the South China Sea and get a great free trade deal as well, all at the same time, and at no extra cost. There is this, I mean, by accident, wandering into isolation and potential disaster because of a complacent view of history. And I think that this is actually even more incumbent upon allies to actually ease up on the focus on sort of mocking Trump and Trumpery, and focus much more on the hard decisions and taking some more responsibility. They can't lay everything at America's door. So,
But to revisit your question, which is an interesting one, of whether the United States solved the European equation, and this gets back to what you're saying, and some of these healthy debates we're seeing in Europe now, inspired in part by President Trump, have to do with how much Europe has to be responsible for its own security. And this gives some people hives, and it gives some people cause for cheers. So what do you think? Is the United States necessary in Europe?
It may not be necessary, but I think it's desirable. But I think what the problem the debate is being had is too easily slips into a kind of lament about populism and Trump, and not about the contributions European countries can make to the Atlantic defence, that it ends up just being a kind of rather dead-end set of complaints and parodies. And you know, pictured in that archetypal moment where all the leaders are giggling about Trump at the recent NATO conference and Trump leaves, rather than actually not doing that and talking seriously about taxing and spending some pounds or spending some dollars. And recognising that actually if the world is changing around them, it's not just a matter of what the world thinks of America, it's what America thinks of its allies, that we should be worried what America thinks of us. And there needs to be more hard choices in that direction. Now, I personally would favour keeping NATO and trying to make it work. But if you want to choose a different future, you've also got to face up to the choices that are involved in that as well. So I don't think the debate is of the quality that we need yet, and there's too much of this, the history that I mentioned, this way of talking about the past.
What do you think? Has the United States solved the European equation? I mean, that's the question, right? If you
Well, what I mean by that is actually it's pretty straightforward, which is that from the moment of German unification, after 1871, Germany was too big for the continent. This was the so-called German problem. There's another German problem about the German character, which I'm not sure how I feel about that. But the German problem as a geopolitical matter, I think, was real. And the problem was that the sort of tenuous balance that had been created in Europe after by the Congress of Vienna after 1815 was basically blown up by the unification of Germany and the emergence of this economic, demographic, and ultimately military sort of mini superpower in the heart of Europe, which Europe by itself couldn't balance anymore. So even with Russia and France allied, and even ultimately, when much against its will, Britain joined the fight, Germany basically was winning World War I in a sort of awful kind of victory. But Mitteleuropa was a fact until the United States entered the war, and even really before American troops were seriously engaged, just by the fact of America's entry into the war, created a new balance, which then America walked away from, and then the imbalance problem came again, and we had World War II. And then what the United States did, which was the Deus Ex Machina role, was basically to say we want Germany, in this case West Germany, to resume its economic capacity. The French and the British would never have allowed that unless the United States was also willing to guarantee their security against Germany, which they did by basically keeping troops in Europe forever. So the question, I think it's a very interesting question, is have we so moved beyond this problem that now you could withdraw the troops and you wouldn't have that problem? For me, NATO is not primarily about Russia. For me, NATO is primarily about the basic stability of Europe. I actually think, and right now you go to Germany and we know the Germans, they're the most Pacific, liberal people in the world, except for the party that's now the third largest party in the Reichstag. But anyway, and it's almost impossible to imagine Germany being a problem again, except that I think you would go back to, even if the German character was the most wonderful character in the world, the German problem would return. This is my concern. And if the United States withdrew, I think you would ultimately get to European instability again. Now, if you add to that the fact that liberalism itself is being challenged in Europe, that the liberal idea certainly in Eastern Europe, but also obviously in Italy, in France, and elsewhere is being challenged. And what you have, above all, is a return to nationalism in Europe. I think if you have a renationalized Europe without the United States playing that role, eventually, whether it returns to its past or a new version of its past, becomes an issue again. And that, for me, is that's what we should be worried about, but it seems almost, I think people find that almost unimaginable.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think people. Well, because I think one of the interesting features of the debate we in DC have been having about the quote liberal international order since. I mean, if I looked at Google Trends, I think that usage of that phrase would have spiked in 2016 because that was a time when people actually started having these arguments again about what it means and what it's for, because this was something that had been taken for granted for so long. And taking for granted again, the German problem is just not a problem anymore. So now we're in a situation with leading politicians on both sides of the aisle actually kicking the tires on these very fundamental questions on what is this for? Why actually do we have all these troops in Germany and Japan? Right. And to what extent can we bring some of these people home? I mean, how does one explain, if we in the DC commentariat cannot explain the value of this thing to an elementary school teacher in Topeka, that's not her fault, that's ours, right? What is the affirmative case that we make that appeals to public opinion about why this thing is important?
Do you mind if I? Yeah.
Please.
So, I mean, Europe, like Asia, is a power center that matters, and both the latent power and the actual power that can be mobilized on that continent. Just as China has shown with its aggregate of wealth and influence how much it can coerce our civil society, like the recent NBA crisis, for example. The case for containment goes across a number of domains. But I think what's critical here is, as well as the case for a transatlantic commitment, there also has to be a new transatlantic settlement. And this is where Bob and I may disagree, I think I'm much more sceptical about America's financial and fiscal position. I think that there is a really dangerous level of out-of-control deficits and debt, which could lead, as the Congressional Budget Office warns, to a serious, not only a serious further global crisis, but an inability to react the same way this time around. And so there's going to have to be some burden shifting, but that also has geopolitical implications. And this is the problem for both Washington and European capitals. Washington, quite reasonably, asks Europe to do more, to spend more, to sacrifice more. But then that's going to result in a more assertive Europe. If it is, in fact, investing more in defence, if it is putting more on the table, it's going to demand more in return, right? It's not going to remain a supplicant or just a satellite. Europe wants Europe will insisting on greater assertion and having a say, as Macron is doing increasingly now, but that's going to cost. You can't just have it for free. And there is something about this marriage between them where if we're going to, as Susan Rice said, renew the vows, there also needs to be discussion about the details around the household and the division of labour. I'm a new father, sorry, this is my metaphorical world.
How's your discussion going?
It's okay. We're still here. So it's
Talk about conflict.
rather than just switching the European commitment on or off, it's also about the terms of that commitment and being realistic about what both sides can expect. And I think you probably could explain that to the bright child.
Well, there's so much to discuss in what you've just said. I mean, if it is okay, I agree with you about our budget deficit, but our budget deficit is being driven more by, right now, tax cuts than by the defense budget and by a refusal to grapple with necessary changes in Social Security, for instance, to reflect the new demographic realities, but because of AARP, which I guess I'm a member of now, unfortunately, you can't even touch. So if I thought that it was the defense budget that was bankrupting the country, I would be more persuaded by that argument. But if you look at any of the budget analysis done by the Domenici budget, the Alice Rivlin budget, it wasn't the defense budget. It was more out of control spending and a bad fiscal policy in general. Anyway, that's a separate question. The conundrum about Europe, obviously, is, first of all, you talk about bargains. The bargain of the post-World War II world was that the European powers were essentially going to give up the traditional geopolitical ambitions. Britain was the largest empire in the world, as you mentioned, and Britain essentially gradually gave up that empire and became a normal country, which I think is a country in secular decline as a geopolitical force, regardless of Brexit. And I agree with you. The notion that Brexit has freed Britain to now be the great power again, I think, is the opposite of the truth. I don't think you would have had Brexit if the British people were even in the mood to play that role, but that's another question. But in any case, that was the bargain, and Germany obviously gave up its ambitions. France gave up very many of its ambitions. So it's those ambitions that drive countries to arm themselves, or it's fear. It's never mateship. And I don't think that we can expect, as long as the Europeans think that A, the threats they face aren't that grave, and B, the United States is kind of always going to be there anyway, I don't think we're ever going to get substantial increases in European defense spending. And from my point of view as an American, I'm prepared to tolerate that because I prefer a European free rider than the Europe of 1930 or the Europe of 1911. And I think that there may be a relationship. I do believe the time when the Europeans finally decide that they do want to arm themselves, we will not be happy about the fact that they've made that decision. And not because Europe is going to go off on its own. I have been, even when I was writing things that the Europeans were offended by, I always said, I want Europe to be a major pole in the international system. I don't fear Europe's role in the world if it expands. My concern is Europe will rearm because Europe itself has ceased to exist as a common entity and will have returned to nationalism. So, and finally, on how do you persuade the elementary school teacher? I think
or the moderator.
Or anybody. I think it's very hard. And the reason I say that is not just because I can't do it. Franklin Roosevelt, who was the most gifted politician in the history of America, could not do it at a time when Nazi Germany was overrunning France and threatening the destruction of Britain. Franklin Roosevelt could not then convince people that the United States ought to get involved. I think what has always been true of America, and it's worth recalling, the way Americans feel today, that's normal way of feeling. What they felt during the Cold War was abnormal, driven very much by fear of communism that was irrational, etc. All kinds of fears drove Americans to accept this role. It's not normal for any country to accept this role. And so I think it's a real uphill battle trying to convince people why any of this is important to them. The oceans, even in a digital age, we think the oceans are going to protect us, and we're not entirely wrong. So I think it's hard.
I want to move it to Q&A, if that's, unless you have a quick.
Just one thing. I think that where we do, you're absolutely right. The tax cuts have been extravagant and getting worse. But I also think that the actual real defence budget, in terms of the total security spend, the kind of spending on operations, the nuclear budget, the intelligence, this gets well over $700-something billion, up to over effectively $1 trillion. That's been a non-trivial exacerbator. Not just in terms of racking up the deficit level, but also there is a historical relationship between military massive build-ups and boom-bust in the economy. So I think that is a part of the fiscal economic picture. Anyway, time for, sorry.
Let's get some questions.
Yeah.
I'll start with Justin.
Thank you so much. Justin Logan from CSS, and at the risk of rolling a grenade up onto the dais, as somebody who remembers the sort of black coffee briefings at AEI, one of the things that the United States has tried to do to order the international system is sort of rework the Middle East. And one thing that I hope I can elicit some fireworks up there from is the United States cares deeply about the Middle East for three main reasons, right? Oil, Israel, and terrorism. It doesn't want major disruptions to Middle Eastern oil, it doesn't want Israel to be destroyed, and it doesn't want to suffer a fusillade of terrorist attacks a la 9/11. In trying to order the Middle East, we've dropped $6 or so trillion over the last couple decades trying to prevent those things. And I wonder whether that's been money well spent, and whether if the United States just sort of disappeared from the Middle East, whether we would suffer any of those things. Thank you.
Who wants it?
I ought to have something to say about this because I'm writing something on it. I think the US does have some interest in the Middle East, but they're either ones that are created by being there, or they're ones that can be managed from a remove. And I think it's a part of the world that is not a fundamental power center in the way that Europe and Asia are. I think that a look at the historical record shows that actually, despite all of those efforts, the US has very limited leverage there, right? For example, you talked about oil, right? The oil price that really matters to the US. The notion that the US garrisons help it to kind of control price risks. Well, when the US had the most troops it's ever had there in 2008, remember the oil crisis, the oil spike that was going on in prices. George Bush Jr. Asked the Saudis to alter their production, and they refused. There is, in other words, oil price matters, but I think there's a non-link between that is assumed to flow from that in the world. I think there are other things that can be more usefully done with resources to create resilience, like strategic petroleum reserves, etc. But also, I think being embroiled there's something about politics in the Gulf that is especially resistant to the kind of coercive power that America can use to get regimes to do what it wants, unless they already want to do it. So one thing that primacists often talk about when they're defending primacy is to say, well, look, the US has this great advantage that it can leave. I mean, the fact that the US is over here and not over there, it has this great advantage that it can threaten to leave, and that's one of the things that persuaded some of its allies to give up their nuclear programs, right? But at the same time, actually suggesting that the US should threaten to leave can also be quite horrifying to a primacist. So I think there's a tension about that. There's something about the Middle East where what you see is reverse leverage, with the US so anxious about losing its access to bases and allies that it ends up going along with and acquiescing in a lot of stuff that I just don't think it should tolerate. Anyway, so that's too long an answer. My apologies.
No, it's a perfectly lengthed answer.
Fireworks, man, come on.
No, well, I guess I could get to the fireworks eventually. I mean, first of all, let's go back. I totally agree with you that especially on the subject of oil, that the Gulf states have been particularly impervious to American pressure. And interestingly, that was true in the 1970s as well. I mean, the greatest damage that's ever been done to the American economy was the oil embargo of 1973. And that was at a time when America was supposedly in its prime and could do anything it wanted, blah, blah, blah. And Nixon had no capacity, and then Ford had no capacity to respond to this. And those were supposedly a time when they were even more dependent on us for their protection than now. So I think that's an endemic reality, which again, because I talk about the 70s, is not necessarily related to our arrogance. And by the way, was it a time when Nixon's strategy in the Middle East was actually to withdraw and to set up the Shah over here and the Saudi family over there, and you guys can run the whole thing and we won't do anything. And it just, which is a long way of saying, I don't know that anybody has an answer to the Middle East. Now, the easiest thing to say about the Middle East was let's just get the hell out of there. And I'm sure that every single one of us would say that is a wonderful idea. And by the way, it's also a tremendous overstatement to say that America was trying to reorder the Middle East. Most of what the United States does in the world, and it was true in the Middle East too, is reactive. There is very infrequently a sort of cosmic strategy. And I think a lot of the strategy that has been attributed, for instance, to the W. Bush administration was ex post facto justification. Mostly they were afraid after 9/11. People were afraid after 9/11. And I think that the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 was based on fear, not on let's reorder. The reordering, let's bring democracy, blah, 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 that was ex post facto justification in my view. Now, and then, so the second, again, as I say, so we would love to get out of the Middle East. And I think the very interesting, and by the way, I don't believe we have a fundamental interest at this point in defending Israel. That is a kind of solipsistic policy. We have to defend Israel so that we can defend Israel. You know what I mean? It's, we have a conflict with Iran because we have to defend Israel, and therefore Israel's an ally in our defense against Iran, and therefore we have to protect Israel. And it all comes back to Israel. It's not at all clear to me. Israel is perfectly now capable of taking care of itself, actually, maybe not without the $3 billion we give them in military assistance. But I don't know about that. And, oil is less of an issue for us since we've become a net exporter ourselves of energy. And we are certainly not as dependent on it. You could say, well, our allies are, and therefore we have to keep, et cetera. So for me, the question is, of course, we would like to get out of the Middle East. But I would say, and I've asked people this question, that all being said, why is it that as far back as you can possibly remember, great powers have been sucked into conflicts in the Middle East before the Middle East was a twinkle in the American eye? Whether it was the British worried about the route to India, whether it was British and French imperial competition, whether it was Russia, etc. The Middle East has this way. I think it has something to do with being the crossroads of various cultures. I think it has to do with geographical location and its own fundamental internal instability, which somehow just invites all this. And even now, you listed the reasons why we would be wary of it. And we've also, we look at the Middle East, it's a mistake, in our minds we say, well, there's the Middle East and there's the Europe and Asia, but of course in the real world, these things are all connected. And it turns out people can walk from the Middle East to Europe. And so, for instance, people would say, well, who cares what happens in Syria? And you could make a case of who cares what happens in Syria if you don't happen to care about 500,000 people dying. But even if you don't care about 500,000 people dying, the Syria crisis has helped destabilize Europe. And Europe is a core interest of the United States. And so it's not so easy to sort of pull these things apart and say, over there, we're not going. Anyway, to me, it's a conundrum, and I don't know what the answer. And maybe you do, and maybe a lighter footprint is the way to go. I'm sure that is where we're going. Even the Bush administration in the early years would have much preferred, Richard Pearl and Rumsfeld had this great idea, we'll just fire missiles at everybody from the mainland of the United States. If we just fire a few missiles, everything will work out. Well, in a way, that's what Trump just did, right? Fired some missiles, shut up Iran, I suppose that's a policy. I'm not sure ultimately where it leads.
I think, sorry, no.
No, yeah, you should.
So you're absolutely right. These parts, these continents are linked. I would say that was a good reason for the Obama administration not to have a kind of halfway intervention in Syria in the first place. That to demand a despot go, then to inject just enough resource, and with your allies, just enough resource into that conflict to make it even worse and more intense and terrible, and then to help trigger that wave of migration. But secondly, part of that picture was a NATO ally manipulating the situation, Turkey, which is, I think, a really pressing question for the US. And I haven't got an easy answer to this, but what to do about the fact that you have NATO, which normally is supposed to stabilize allies. In fact, you've got this one that's actively working against and manipulating migration as a geopolitical tool. So that's one where I would still kind of opt on kind of managing it from afar and actually being very careful about intervention in the Middle East, precisely because if you're not willing to really try and exert control by putting boots on the ground, it's better actually not to just do things that inadvertently, tragically make it even worse.
Let's take one from over here. You in the second row, sir.
Thank you. It's a very impressive discussion. My name is Herbert Regenbogen. I'm a fellow here at the IPR. And as I look into those historical geopolitical issues, the issues of populism, of fear, it's really surrounded by the destabilization of the rule of law. And what is really the role of the rule of law is based on governance. What is the governance of the 21st century? What is that principle underlying current of values? And every nation in their own narrative has a value. They have a religion. Even if it's not a religion, it's a belief. And all this surrounds consciousness. And all this is imbued into foreign policy or public policy. So what is your vision of the foundation of values in the 21st century? Is it again the rule of law, or is it something else?
I don't know. Can I have a minute to think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, are you asking what we think or what we want? Okay. Oh, good. I'll keep talking and then we'll run out of time. We don't have to answer any more questions like this. I mean, first of all, let me just take a little bit of exception to the rule of law, because there are all kinds of rules of law, right? I mean, you can have a rule of law in a divine right monarchy, and the rule of law is about doing what the monarch says, ultimately, or it means abiding by the whatever religion that happens to be in the state. When I think of rule of law and what's important in liberal societies, what it means is that everyone is equal under the law. And that is the rule of law. And so my desire is to have, the defense of liberalism be as widespread as is, reasonably achievable, which is to say what we do have in Europe and the United States and in parts of Asia and parts of elsewhere in the world are states where the rights of the individual are protected, not the rights of the state. But that, as I was saying before, is not the historical norm. The historical norm is to privilege the state in whatever guise and to subordinate the rights of the individual. And I think that, there is a reasonable case to be made that eventually that is what we will go back to. The Russian state, although it had to, for a variety of reasons, based on its communist background, the fact that it did have a communist background and the fact that it's also has had to exist in the liberal world, talks more about the rights of the individual. But the bottom line is the state is supreme, and in China the state is explicitly supreme. So I think that it's reasonable to assume that that could be the dominant fact. I don't know whether I've answered your question, because rule of law is as I say, rule of law, it depends on what law you're talking about.
I mean, to follow on from that, I mean, the notion of global governance and global rule of law, these ideas, they kind of are a bit big for me. I think actually there needs to be a refocus on getting back to some basics about one of the most important normative values, which is the prevention of major war, as a kind of baseline international agreement. There's not that many things that all the countries in the world really do agree on, but there are a few things. Working out how to better conserve that whilst rebuilding it, doing the necessary rebuilding at home. I mean, the United States always has had this, what Walter McDougall talked about, this dualism between this being the promised land and the crusader state. And there's always going to be that missionary sort of impulse, and there's always going to be that idea of creating something different and better at home. And I think the balance swung too far in the crusader direction. But in terms of what the United States does abroad in terms of interactions is finding those basic principles of order that allow for actually quite a lot of diversity, which means a lot of things you don't like, right? I mean, that's the problem with diversity. We all love diversity except about the things we actually disapprove of. But there's going to be a lot of things we have to disapprove of in a world that is more multipolar, more plural, harder to govern, harder to kind of exert hegemonic power over, finding the ways in which we can have enough stability in order to preserve liberty at home. And I think that's ambitious enough for me without these kind of very ornate sort of things about all these other elevated sort of demands.
Let's move back to this side. On the side here.
What do you think of Trump's policy of peace through strength?
Well, I think there are many pathways to ruin, and one of them is an over-reverence for strength. Over-reverence for strength can, in some circumstances, lead to inadvertent spiral and war. The Kaiserreich believed in peace through strength, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis, where both sides were trying to be strong and look strong and project strength, almost went out of control. Trump, very anxious to project strength with Iran, could have gone very badly in January, could go very badly again. There's no magic formula that can be reduced to sort of 3 words, but one wants to have enough strength to be able to deter with enough prudence and enough diplomacy to be able to reassure. And there's no easy formula to do that. One of the difficulties in having a kind of grand strategy, people get locked into certain analogies and certain notions, so the Munich analogy, for example, but I think there's also the other examples, for example, Philip II of Spain, where it's kind of endless war, endless debt, and doctrinaire belief in the universal mission can also lead to disaster. So there's no certain recipe, but just saying peace through strength and continuing with kind of reckless policies is a sure way of actually leading to, I think, something else. But you do need to be, I agree, strong enough to be able to deter and things like that. So it's a hard one.
Well, I don't have to really add to that, other than I think every president probably since Theodore Roosevelt has said they're for peace through strength.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost a hollow. It's almost like saying I believe in American, America being the greatest country in the world, or let's make America great again, or whatever. I mean, it's a pretty meaningless phrase, I think.
Let me move back to this side again. In the way back with the glasses.
Thanks so much. I'm losing my voice. John Askinis, a fellow at CSS. Dr. Kagan, I think I agree with your picture of Russia and China as being far more constrained than the threat inflators here in D.C. Would have us believe. But you erred, you erred in saying that Russia and America never fought a war. America sent 5,000 troops to invade and overthrow the Soviet Union as part of the Allied intervention into the Soviet Union. And that raises my question and the problem I see in not so much what you said tonight, but in some of your other writings. Just about the only thing that can get Russia to do really nasty things in Europe, in Eastern Europe, is the threat of regime change. That was true in the Holy Alliance, that was true in the interwar period, and it's been true since then. If, in fact, America has tremendous structural advantages in its security and underlying its order, why has the United States had an activist foreign policy which has antagonized, at least in this case, Russia? Why are American diplomats running around Kiev pulling strings? If this is the one thing that can pull the Russians towards the Chinese and cause them to engage in nasty behavior.
Well, as I mentioned before, I don't agree that that's necessarily what's going to happen no matter what we do. I do think there's a real limit to Russian-Chinese cooperation and rapprochement. But you raise a much deeper question about how to deal with Russia and what upsets Russia. You started off by talking about regime change. I mean, there's no regime change policy toward Russia today. It's been a long time since I think anybody even, began to seriously contemplated that. So it's not that Putin fears he shouldn't fear an active policy of regime change. But look, let's face it, autocratic governments ever since the birth of liberalism have feared being toppled by their own people seeking liberalism. I mean, the so-called Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria feared the liberal contagion and intervened all over the place trying to stamp it out, Poland, Italy, and elsewhere. And I think there's an inherent fear of an autocrat. And so the mere existence of an American superpower, it seems to me, has always been it's threatening to the Chinese, it's threatening to Putin, it was threatening to the Soviets, etc. So I think that is unavoidable. Ukraine is the desire of everybody to sort of feed Ukraine back to Russia. I will never cease to be amazed by it. It isn't even we who declared that Ukraine was an independent entity. It actually was Moscow that created Ukraine as a republic of the Soviet Union, and then basically recognized an independent Ukraine, after the end of the Cold War. So, it wasn't an American assertion to kind of rip Ukraine out of the heart of Kievan Rus, and it sort of existed. So then you're left with the problem, and this gets to the argument that Patrick is making. Okay, so fine, Ukraine is an independent country, recognized as an independent country by Russia. So that's not in dispute. So the question is, so what do you do? Do you try to help Ukraine, sort of navigate its way through the world and protect it against Russia, or do you just let Russia take it if it wants it? And, I would have a hard time saying to the Ukrainian people who do not want to be part of Russia that life is tough, but in order to make Russia happy, you have to go be part of Russia and live under Putin's regime. I would have a hard time with it. But even from a realpolitik, sort of a cold that's divorced the morality from it, I'm not sure that is even itself the solution, because it seems to me that if Russia is trying to sort of recreate its image of itself, which is what countries do, it's what China's trying to do, its image of itself in Europe, Ukraine is the beginning, not the end. And Russia historically does not think that Poland is a country. Not just that Ukraine isn't a country. We created Poland, recreated Poland after it had been divided for centuries. It was the Treaty of Versailles that created modern Poland and enforced that. But there's nothing inherent about Poland that, the Poles would not be happy to hear this, but they know historically that that's true. And so the question would be, are we sure that once we handed over the Ukrainians to Moscow, that then Moscow would be satisfied and they would be, and then we wouldn't be in a geopolitical competition and they would happily then come to our, but happily come to our side and help us against the Chinese, etc. I'm skeptical about that. So, there was a really good case to be made that why should anybody give a hoot about what Japan does in Manchuria? And in fact, people at the time argued very strenuously that Manchuria was in Japan's sphere of influence, it was barely Chinese to begin with, which was true, and why can't Japan have Manchuria? And of course, as we know, Manchuria was just the beginning, it wasn't the end. And so wouldn't we have been better off preventing the Japanese from doing what they did in Manchuria? I think the answer is yes. So you have to at least take all these issues into consideration and not just simply say, why are we antagonizing Russia? It is possible that Russia will refuse to be not antagonized.
So I think we have to offer them a real choice in that matter. Russia might say no, and so this is not just up to us, the US-led
No,
government.
we don't want, no, after you give us Ukraine, we don't want to make nice with you.
So I wouldn't say giving Russia Ukraine, but I think the difference between saying feeding Ukraine and saying we're not going to enlarge NATO further, and actually one of the tragedies for this, and this is where we might disagree, is the European Union/NATO eastward march, which many European diplomats said, well, look, this is not geopolitics. This is just expanding the realm of trade. We don't do geopolitics. We don't do spheres of influence. As Angela Merkel said, I thought we'd left all that behind. Well, to Russia, it did look like a geopolitical expansion. If you've had Russia's 20th century, you can be sort of forgiven for being anxious about security for Western forces marching towards you, even if they don't look anything like what they've actually had. There is a kind of understandable security dilemma there. But that expansion actually is one of the things that have threatened Ukraine. Right? It hasn't been great for Ukraine that that's happened in that way. And the cruelty of forcing a country that straddles east and west to have to make a choice, rather than to kind of live in this unsatisfying existence, but now it's much more violent. And I think that it's possible that Russia could have been a predator anyway, but I see Russia as more kind of defensively reacting to what it sees as a security threat, not primarily because it actually wants Ukraine. I think Russia would have a terrible time invading Ukraine and trying to occupy it. It would be, for Russia with its kind of problems, that would be very difficult. I think Crimea is difficult enough. But Russia does actually fear, for example, Western support, overt support for opposition parties. Michael McFaul, the ambassador, with whom I would agree with nothing, sort of admitted that actually we do have, he said we do have form in overthrowing regimes, and I guess when I was entertaining the opposition at the ambassador's residence, that was antagonistic to a country that is frightened of colour revolutions, it is frightened of subversion, and actually, ironically, sees itself as defending, at least for itself, this Westphalian principle of sovereignty. That Russia also believes there's a post-war order, a constitutional order that it stands for against this dangerous regime change thing. Now, all of that, take away all of that, and Russia might still choose to behave in a predatory fashion, but I think inadvertently we help to bring on that crisis, and I think changing some of that logic and actually trying to find a way out of that, not so that China and Russia would come in on our side, I wouldn't say that, but creating enough of a space where the historical friction between Russia and China could then re-emerge, so that we would have less of a problem actually trying to do a much more pressing thing, which is trying to find a way of balancing against China's bid for hegemony without a major war.
I think we're close to cocktail time, unless there's time for one more question.
Sure.
Okay, in the back, in the way back.
I was glad to see some evidence of disagreement. Until now, I thought we were in the 2000 election again, where people weren't quite sure. Although if you choose one versus the other, you end up in very different places. So back to the Middle East. I don't want to keep us mired in the Middle East, but, asking the Dr. Kagan, who wrote Neocon Nation, who was one of the most prominent advocates for the Iraq War outside of government. Now, there's some agreement up there that our biggest problems geopolitically now are Russia and China. There might be disagreement on how to handle that. Do you think that we've been disadvantaged somehow by our policy in the Middle East over the last 20 years, which the invasion of Iraq created a certain path dependence? For example, you don't get to ISIS without the toppling of Saddam Hussein. You don't get to the sort of conflagration of civil war, I would argue, without the toppling of Saddam Hussein. And to correct something you said earlier, the first discussion they had about regime change in Iraq in the Bush administration preceded 9/11 by 6 months. And that's in a memoir of a Treasury Secretary. So,
of the Treasury Secretary, okay.
Who was at the cabinet meeting.
Yeah, I know. I understand that people talked about it, but that was not there is a difference.
Sure, but
people talk about all kinds of things.
I'm just sick of the people were scared argument. People are scared throughout human history. This was a major geopolitical blunder. But the question is, do you think we are less well positioned to deal with Russia and China now after pissing away a lot of blood, treasure, and readiness in the Middle East?
I must say I appreciate their sober and balanced presentation of things. I didn't say I was no. Well, okay. Have you already been to the cocktail period? The short answer is no, actually. Now, the way that I would answer yes is that obviously it's had a tremendous effect on American domestic public opinion. I think that American public opinion was already moving away from this sort of Cold War era expansive view of foreign policy, and that there was growing criticism ever since the end of the Cold War anyway. But Iraq certainly acted as a catalyst that I think drove many Americans to decide that we really shouldn't be engaged in not only in this way, but in many ways around the world. So in that respect, I would say that's been a problem. I guess the question is, how much would we have gone there eventually anyway? As a geostrategic matter, I mean, what are we arguing? That our allies, despite the fact that many of them were very unhappy about the Iraq war, are now mostly worried that we're going to abandon them, not that we're the big bully that we seem to be to them in Iraq.
When you make something worse, people are usually worried if you're going to fix it.
I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand. Why don't you explicate that?
If we're stuck in the Middle East, that's one of you said that earlier. I'd like to leave the Middle East.
No, but you asked me whether it's having an impact on our ability to deal with Russia and China, and I said the answer is no. We are both stuck in the Middle East and able to deal with Russia and China. And the reason we're able to deal with Russia and China, in my view, is that because our alliance structures are still very strong insofar as we value them, and those alliance structures provide a tremendous deterrent to both Russia and China in whatever aspirations they may have. So my very straightforward answer to your question is no.
Cocktail time?
Time for a beverage.
Do you want to answer?
Okay.
Sorry to make it unpleasant.
Cocktail time, man.
Okay, very quickly. I think America was frightened after 9/11, but that fear translated itself very quickly into an ambition to reorder a region. That fear took on a very big and American impulse, which is the transformation to deal with the security problem. There were lots of things going on with the Iraq War, but that was, I think, a big part of it from the beginning. I think it did put America at a net disadvantage compared to if it hadn't done it. I don't think it's the difference between night and day, but there was a lot of consumption of resources, there's a lot of exhaustion that come out of it. And I think, but fundamentally, the war on terror as a whole is implicated in the coarsening of politics that leads to Trump and Trumpism and this political threat to the Republic.
Cocktail time?
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Bob. That was great.
That was a lot of fun.
Thanks very much. Thanks for reading the book. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I look forward to getting my copy.